China's domestic crayfish industry has been riding a wave of global demand recently. As the world's largest crayfish producer, China processed more than 1.4 million tons of the crustaceans last year, a more than 15% increase from the year prior.
They arrived under the cover of darkness, hitching a ride across the sea like a silent, armored army. For a very long time, they were the absolute enemy. A red tide of mud-dwelling monsters that tore through dams and choked the life out of the earth. Farmers cursed them. Scientists feared them. The crawfish has been a disaster. But while the rest of the world saw a biological tragedy, China saw a billion-dollar menu. This is how a hated pest became a global empire that brought Europe to its knees. The annoying mudbugs. Imagine you're a farmer in the 1930s. You've got enough to worry about with the weather and the markets. And then suddenly, the ground starts moving. Not from an earthquake, but from a literal carpet of red, clicking armor. This wasn't some slow-motion environmental shift. It was a biological blitzkrieg. The red swamp crawfish didn't ask for permission to enter China. They just showed up, and they brought a very specific set of skills, eating everything in sight and digging holes through anything that stood in their way. The crazy part is that these guys aren't even native to Asia. They're actually from the southern United States. Think Louisiana bayous and muddy swamps. Interesting. They took a detour through Japan in 1929, originally intended to be a cheap snack for bullfrogs. But if there is one thing you should know about the crawfish, it's that they are the ultimate escape artists. They didn't stay in the frog ponds for long. A few escaped here, a few were carried there, and before anyone could blink, they were crossing the border into China's Jiangsu province. Once they hit the Yangtze River Delta, it was game over. This area is a giant, watery playground, and for the crawfish, it was like finding an all-you-can-eat buffet that never closed. They are the ultimate trash eaters. They'll eat dead fish, rotting plants, insect larvae, and even each other if things get desperate. Because they were in a brand new environment, they had no natural enemies. No birds or big fish knew how to handle these aggressive, pincher-wielding aliens yet. So they did what they do best. They multiplied. A single female can lay hundreds of eggs at a time. Within just a few decades, they had spread from a few puddles in Nanjing to nearly every waterway in eastern China. They moved through canals, hopped across wet fields during rainstorms, and basically set up shop in every rice paddy they could find. What started as a tiny shipment of frog food had transformed into a massive, unstoppable red wave. To the locals at the time, it didn't look like a business opportunity. It looked like the end of their livelihood. And man, did they make a mess of the place. War in the paddy. It's not just sitting around waiting to be caught. It is a relentless, tiny demolition expert. The primary battlefield for this war was the rice paddy. Now, a rice paddy isn't just a field. It's a delicately balanced piece of hydraulic engineering. You need the water to stay at a very specific level to keep the rice plants healthy. Farmers spend generations building up these narrow dirt ridges or berms to hold that water in place. This is back-breaking work that requires constant maintenance and precision. Enter the crawfish. These guys are world-class burrowers. They don't just stay on the surface. They dig deep, winding tunnels into the mud to hide from heat or to lay their eggs. When thousands of them start drilling into the dirt ridges of a rice farm, those ridges turn into Swiss cheese. Suddenly, the water starts leaking out through 1,000 tiny holes. A farmer wakes up, and his field, the field that represents his entire year's income, is bone dry because a bunch of mudbugs tunneled through his dams overnight. In some cases, the damage was so bad that entire embankments would just collapse under their own weight. It was structural sabotage on a massive scale, and it drove people absolutely crazy. You can't just patch a hole when the entire foundation is riddled with tunnels, but they weren't just destroying the plumbing, they were eating the profits too. Really disastrous. Crawfish have these incredibly sharp, powerful pincers, and they aren't picky about how they use them. They would march through the flooded fields and snip off young rice seedlings just for the fun of it, or eat the tender roots before the plant even had a chance to grow. It was like having a million tiny lawnmowers running through your garden, except these lawnmowers also carried diseases that could wipe out local aquatic life. Every morning, farmers would find floating green stalks, the remains of their hard work, bobbing on the surface of the water. For years, the government and the farmers tried everything to kill them off. They used heavy pesticides, they tried to trap them by the thousands, and they tried to drain the ponds completely to bake them out. Nothing worked. The crawfish are survival specialists. They just dug deeper into the cool, damp mud, waited for the poison to wash away or the water to return, and popped back up a few weeks later like nothing had happened. They were faster, tougher, and more numerous than anyone ever expected. It was a total disaster for rural China. People saw them as a disgusting, invasive plague that had zero value and brought nothing but destruction. It felt like a war that humanity was destined to lose, one snip of a rice stalk at a time. The frustration was reaching a boiling point, but someone got hungry, and everything dramatically changed. The spicy pivot. So, how do you fix a problem that refuses to die? You eat it, but for a long time, that seemed like a crazy idea. In the 80s, if you told a Chinese citizen that crawfish would one day be a luxury snack, they probably would have laughed in your face. Back then, crawfish were seen as bottom feeders that lived in the dirtiest water imaginable. They were the cockroaches of the river. They had a muddy, earthy taste that wasn't exactly appetizing, and they were a huge pain to clean. For decades, they were just something poor kids caught for fun, or something you fed to pigs when you had nothing else. The turning point happened in the early 90s in places like Chuyi and Tianjin. A few brave street vendors and local chefs decided to get creative. They realized that if you can't get rid of the muddy flavor, you have to overpower it. They started experimenting with heavy, aggressive spices. We're talking about the big three of Chinese flavor: garlic, ginger, and green onions, but kicked up to 11. They threw in handfuls of dried red chilies and a massive dose of Sichuan peppercorns, which create that famous mala numbing sensation on your tongue. Suddenly, the trash fish didn't taste like mud anymore. It tasted like a spicy, savory explosion. They called it mala xiaolongxia, or spicy little lobsters. The name change was a stroke of marketing genius. Calling them mudbugs makes you want to reach for a shoe to squash them, but calling them little lobsters makes you reach for your wallet. Street food stalls started popping up everywhere, and the smell of spicy crawfish began to drift through the night air of China's growing cities. This was the birth of the night market king. As China's economy started to boom, people had more disposable income and were staying out later. Crawfish became the ultimate late-night snack. But there was a catch, literally. Because the crawfish were so messy, you had to wear plastic gloves and use both hands to crack the shells. This meant you couldn't check your phone while you were eating. In an age where everyone is glued to their screens, the crawfish became a social savior. You had to actually talk to the people you were with. The demand didn't just grow, it skyrocketed. What started as a way for a few street vendors to make a buck turned into a national obsession. Soon, the wild crawfish weren't enough to satisfy the hunger of millions. The price started to climb, and suddenly, those farmers who used to spend all day trying to kill the crawfish realized they were sitting on a gold mine. The disaster was officially over, and the era of the crawfish entrepreneur had begun. Before we dive into how the industry grew, let's travel to Europe and see how they reacted when China did the opposite. Conquering the West. When China's crawfish machine finally turned its gaze toward Europe, it wasn't just looking for a new market. It was walking into a cultural trap that had been set for centuries. You see, Europe, specifically Scandinavia, already had a deep, almost religious obsession with crawfish. In Sweden, they have these legendary kräftskiva parties every August. Imagine a whole nation putting on funny paper hats, drinking schnapps and singing songs to celebrate the harvest of their native European noble crawfish. It's a huge deal, but there was a massive problem. Europe was running out of bugs. A devastating plague had wiped out most of their local species, and the strict environmental laws made it nearly impossible to farm them at scale. This is where the shock comes in. European countries had spent decades trying to keep the red swamp crawfish out. They viewed the species as a biological terrorist, an invasive nightmare that would destroy their pristine rivers and drive native species to extinction. They passed laws, they set up barriers, and they issued warnings. But while Europe was busy treating the crawfish as a threat to be managed, China was treating it as a product to be perfected. By the time European demand hit a fever pitch in the early 2010s, China was ready to step in and save the party. The scale of the takeover was breathtaking. Suddenly, the traditional Swedish crawfish party was being powered almost entirely by factories in Hubei province. China started exporting massive quantities of pre-cooked frozen crawfish that were tailored specifically for European tastes. They weren't the spicy, numbing mala version you'd find in Shanghai. These were boiled in dill and salt to mimic the traditional Nordic recipe. European supermarkets were flooded with these bright red boxes. Before anyone realized what was happening, nearly 90% of the crawfish eaten in Europe was coming from China. It was an economic gut punch. European fishermen and small-scale farmers couldn't compete with the sheer efficiency and low cost of the Chinese rice crawfish system. How do you compete with a country that has turned an invasive pest into a high-tech integrated industry with its own colleges and logistics hubs? The shock wasn't just about the money. It was about the realization that China had solved a problem that Europe was still struggling to contain. While the West saw an ecological disaster, the East saw a global supply chain. Even the toughest EU food safety inspectors were surprised. China knew that to keep the European market, they had to meet incredibly strict standards regarding heavy metals and pesticides. They didn't just meet them. They built dedicated export zones with higher standards than almost anywhere else in the world. They turned the dirty mudbug into a clean, premium export that passed every test. It was a masterclass in market dominance. China had successfully taken a species that Europe feared and sold it back to them as a luxury they couldn't live without. To go from a street snack to a global industry, China started a better way to farm. The genius of co-culture. Once the demand for spicy little lobsters went through the roof, farmers faced a massive dilemma. They had a huge market crying out for more bugs, but they still had to grow rice. You see, land in China is precious. You can't just stop growing a staple food like rice to start a massive crustacean ranch without causing some serious food security issues. For a while, it looked like they were stuck. But then, a stroke of agricultural genius emerged from the muddy fields of Hubei province, the integrated rice crawfish system. This wasn't just a new way to farm, it was a total reimagining of how an ecosystem could work for humans. Instead of fighting the crawfish, the farmers decided to invite them into the family business. They realized that the very things that made crawfish a pest in the past could be used as an advantage if the environment was controlled. Here is how it works. Farmers dig a series of deep ditches or canals right around the perimeter of the rice paddies. During the hot parts of the day, the crawfish hang out in the cool, deep water of the ditches. When the sun goes down or the weather cools, they crawl out into the shallow water where the rice is growing. This created a perfect circular loop of life. The crawfish acted like tiny, unpaid farm hands. They ate the weeds that usually choke the rice plants, and they hunted down harmful insects like mosquitoes and larvae that would otherwise eat the crop. Even better, their waste, basically crawfish manure, acted as a high-quality, organic fertilizer that pumped nutrients directly into the soil. This meant the farmers could stop spending a fortune on chemical fertilizers and toxic pesticides. Because you can't use heavy chemicals on the rice if you want the crawfish to live, the rice produced in these fields became naturally organic and much higher quality. It turned out that the rice grown alongside crawfish was actually better than the rice grown alone. It fetched a higher price at the market because it was green and eco-friendly. Meanwhile, the crawfish were growing fat and happy on a diet of pests and rice debris. The farmers were essentially getting 2 harvests for the price of 1. They went from making a modest living on just grain to making a killing on high-priced seafood and premium rice. By the early 2000s, this Hubei model started spreading across the country like wildfire. The government saw the potential and poured money into research, helping farmers optimize the timing of when to flood the fields and when to harvest the bugs. They turned it into a science. They even figured out that the crawfish's constant movement helped aerate the soil, making the rice roots stronger. It was the ultimate win-win scenario. The biological disaster that used to break dams and destroy seedlings had been domesticated into a highly efficient, multi-billion-dollar machine. It's one of the best examples in history of using nature's own quirks to solve a human-made problem. But the success wasn't just about farming, it was about how we eat. The social glue. China, food is rarely just about calories. It is a social event. But more than a decade ago, something started to go wrong with the way we hang out. You've seen it at every restaurant. 4 people sitting together, but everyone is staring at their own phone, scrolling through social media and ignoring the actual humans in front of them. The smartphone was killing the vibe of the traditional night market. Then came the crawfish, the ultimate anti-smartphone food. Think about the physical process of eating a crawfish. These things are delicious, but they are a total mess. They are covered in oil, chili flakes, and spicy sauce. To get at that tiny, sweet piece of tail meat, you have to get your hands dirty. You have to snap the head, peel the armor, and dig in. Even with those thin plastic gloves they give you at the restaurants, the oil always finds a way in. Your hands become slick, spicy, and completely useless for touching a touch screen. If you try to check your notifications mid-meal, you're going to end up with a $500 repair bill for a grease-clogged phone. This created a weirdly perfect social vacuum. Because no one could use their phones, people were forced to do something radical. They had to talk to each other. Crawfish became the glue that held the social fabric together. It became a ritual. You sit down with a giant steaming basin of bright red crawfish, grab a couple of cold beers, and spend the next 2 hours peeling and talking. It leveled the playing field. Whether you were a billionaire CEO or a college student, you both had red oil on your face and were struggling with a stubborn shell. It became the great equalizer of the Chinese nightlife. This crawfish culture became so huge that it started influencing the way cities were built. Entire crawfish streets popped up in major hubs like Beijing and Shanghai, where dozens of restaurants competed for the spiciest recipe. It became a symbol of the night economy, a term used to describe the massive amount of money spent after the sun goes down. People weren't just buying food. They were buying an experience and a way to reconnect with their friends. The demand grew from a local craving to a national obsession that required millions of tons of product every year. Soon, the crawfish started showing up everywhere in pop culture. It was in movies. It was the subject of viral memes, and it even became a metric for how well a city's economy was doing. If the crawfish stalls were full, the city was thriving. This cultural momentum is what provided the fuel for the industrial engine. It wasn't just a trend that faded away, it became a permanent part of the lifestyle. The mudbug had successfully rebranded itself from a dirty, invasive pest into the star of the show. It was the most successful makeover in history. But to feed a whole country, you need more than just a few street stalls. The industrial machine. Feeding a national obsession of this magnitude isn't just about farming. It's about a level of logistical wizardry that would make most global corporations weep with envy. Once the rice crawfish model proved it could produce millions of tons of bugs, China had to figure out how to move a highly perishable, mud-dwelling creature from a rural pond to a dinner plate in a city 1,000 miles away, all while keeping it fresh. This led to the birth of an industrial machine so massive and efficient that it changed the landscape of the Chinese economy. At the center of this hurricane is the city of Zhanjiang in Hubei province, which has effectively become the Silicon Valley of crawfish. In Zhanjiang, crawfish isn't just a snack, it's the entire world. The city houses massive trading centers where the price of crawfish is tracked on giant digital screens, much like the New York Stock Exchange. Every morning at dawn, thousands of tons of live crawfish are brought in from the surrounding farms. Within hours, they are sorted by size, cleaned, and packed into specialized, temperature-controlled containers. The logistics network is a marvel of the modern age. We're talking about cold chain logistics, a fleet of refrigerated trucks and high-speed rail links that ensure a crawfish caught at 4 a.m. can be served spicy and steaming in a Beijing restaurant by dinner time. But the real secret to the industry's explosion was the move toward processing. Scientists and engineers realized that to truly dominate, they couldn't just rely on live sales. They built massive factories that look more like high-tech laboratories than food plants. In these facilities, millions of crawfish are washed by ultrasonic cleaners, flash frozen at temperatures that preserve the texture of the meat perfectly, and pre-packaged with signature sauces. This meant that suddenly, you didn't have to go to a street stall to get at your fix. You could buy a box of spicy little lobsters at a supermarket or order them on an app, pop them in the microwave for 3 minutes, and have a restaurant-quality meal at home. This industrialization created a massive wave of employment. It wasn't just for the farmers. We're talking about thousands of jobs in packaging, logistics, marketing, and even specialized education. There are literally crawfish colleges in China now, where students can major in crawfish culinary arts or aquaculture management. They study everything from the chemistry of the perfect spicy oil to the genetics of the fastest-growing mudbugs. It sounds funny until you realize these graduates are entering a $50 billion industry. The government backed this growth with massive infrastructure projects, building roads and high-speed internet in rural areas specifically to help crawfish farmers reach global markets. By 2022, the output was staggering. China was producing nearly 3 million tons of crawfish a year. To put that in perspective, that's enough to give every single person on Earth a decent serving of spicy seafood. They had turned a scattered, accidental invasion into a centralized, high-tech powerhouse. They had standardized the size, the taste, and the delivery speed to the point where the crawfish was no longer a wild animal. It was a reliable industrial product. Once they had perfected this machine at home, they realized they had a surplus. The genius didn't stop at the meat. They started using the leftovers too. Zero-waste economy. You might think that once the tail meat is gone and the spicy sauce is licked off your fingers, the story is over. But in the world of the Chinese crawfish empire, a pile of empty shells isn't trash, it's a gold mine. As the industry hit that massive scale of 3 million tons per year, the amount of waste was becoming a serious environmental headache. We're talking about mountain-sized piles of discarded heads and shells that used to just rot in landfills. But remember the theme here. China doesn't see a problem, it sees a resource. They decided to take those shells and break them down into their chemical components. And what they found changed the game. The secret ingredient inside a crawfish shell is something called chitin. It's a natural polymer that makes the shell hard. And when you process it, you get chitosan. This stuff is like the Swiss Army knife of the chemical world. Scientists in China's specialized crawfish research institutes figured out that they could extract this material on an industrial scale. Now, instead of paying to get rid of shells, factories are selling them to biotech firms. This turned the entire industry into a circular economy, where every single gram of the creature is worth money. So, what do you do with a pulverized crawfish shell? A lot more than you'd think. Chitosan is used in everything from high-end medicine to agriculture. In the medical world, it's used to make specialized bandages that can stop bleeding almost instantly. And it's even being used in drug delivery systems to help medicine target specific parts of the body. In the beauty world, it's a star ingredient in moisturizers and hair care products because of its ability to hold moisture. They've even figured out how to turn crawfish shells into biodegradable plastic. Imagine a world where the packaging for your food is made out of the shells of the very thing you just ate. But they didn't stop at the chemicals. The leftovers, like the heads and the guts, which are packed with protein, are being processed into high-quality animal feed and organic fertilizers. This goes right back into the rice crawfish cycle we talked about earlier. It's a perfect loop. The shells feed the soil grows the rice, and the rice protects the next generation of crawfish. This efficiency is a huge part of why China can keep prices so low while keeping profits so high. They aren't just selling seafood. They are running a massive biochemical operation. This zero-waste approach was the final piece of the puzzle that truly shocked global competitors. Most countries struggle to make aquaculture profitable because the waste management costs are so high. China flipped the script. By turning a waste product into high-value medical and industrial exports, they added an entirely new layer of revenue to the industry. It's a level of whole animal utilization that makes the industry incredibly resilient. So, is it all sunshine and spicy tales, or is there a catch? The risks and its future. When you've built a $50 billion empire on the back of a single mud-dwelling creature, you're basically walking a tightrope. The success of the crawfish in China is legendary, but as any good host knows, the bigger the party, the bigger the potential hangover. We are now entering a phase where the industry has to face some cold, hard truths. The first big one is the climate. These bugs are tough, but they aren't invincible. Rising temperatures and unpredictable floods are starting to mess with the delicate rice crawfish cycle. If the water gets too hot too fast, the crawfish don't grow. They just burrow deep into the mud and stay there, leaving farmers with empty nets and a lot of spicy sauce, but nothing to put it on. Then there's the issue of the market itself. For years, the demand was a bottomless pit, but we might finally be hitting peak crawfish. There are now so many farms and so many restaurants that the competition is becoming brutal. Prices are starting to fluctuate wildly. In some seasons, there's such a massive surplus that the price crashes, leaving smaller farmers in the dust while the giant industrial players soak up the profits. It's the classic boom and bust cycle of any gold rush, and the crawfish rush is no exception. If everyone is growing the same thing, the value of that thing eventually starts to slide. We also have to talk about the biology. Whenever you have millions of animals packed into a tight space, you're asking for trouble. Diseases that used to be rare are now becoming more common in the crowded paddies. If a super virus hits the crawfish population, it wouldn't just be a localized problem. It would be a national economic catastrophe. Scientists are working overtime to develop super crawfish that are resistant to disease, but nature always seems to find a way to strike back. It's a constant arms race between human engineering and biological reality. There's the environmental irony. China spent decades turning an invasive species into a domestic hero, but now they have to make sure it doesn't escape back into the wrong places. As the industry expands, the risk of these highly aggressive, genetically optimized crawfish leaking into protected nature reserves is a constant worry. They are still ecosystem destroyers at heart. We've just given them a job. If they get fired and go back to being wild, they could finish the job they started in the 1920s, wiping out whatever native biodiversity is left in the rural waterways. Do you eat crawfish too, or ever saw one? Subscribe to our channel for more, and don't forget to click on that notification bell.